Welcome to our last video in our series on vertebrate diversity. In this video, we're going to focus on our last class in the vertebrate subphylum, the mammals. One of the interesting things we're going to do in this group is look at the three subclasses of mammals, the monotremes, the marsupials, and the placentals. But before we do that, before we look at this diversity, let's focus on the general characteristics of all mammals. What are the defining characteristics? There are a few characteristics that certainly are defining of mammals, and then one characteristic that is the defining. But let's start with the obvious one, hair. All mammals have hair. When we look at hair, it's a derivative of the skin. It's formed by the skin. It's made of keratin, which incidentally is the same protein that makes scales of reptiles and the bird's feathers, which suggests that hair evolved from scales as did feathers. The next characteristic that we have that's defining of mammals is the presence of skin glands. Mammals have scent glands, sebaceous glands, which are oil glands associated with hair follicles, sweat glands, and finally, the defining characteristics of the group mammals, mammary glands, which produce milk. Mammals are the only animals that can sustain their young by feeding them from nourishment of their own body. That's pretty interesting. Let's take a closer look at these skin glands. If we zoom into this diagram, we can see that here's a hair follicle, and associated with that follicle is a sebaceous gland. It produces oil. That oil gland lubricates the hair as it moves out, and also so that hair is covered in oil, which gives our and then the oil is also on our skin, which gives our skin a waterproofing because some of the oils are lipids, and lipids repel water. We also see in this diagram sweat gland, and the sweat is an excretion organ which gets rid of water to the surface, also ammonia and some salts, but as the sweat goes onto the surface of the skin, it evaporates away, which helps cool the body, so that's going to play a role in temperature regulation. It's also a derivative of the skin. I don't have a picture of scent glands, but let's look at mammary glands. Obviously, the mammary glands, again, are uniquely mammalian. That's where the name comes from. And there are these glands that are in the skin that produce milk, which can then be secreted out of the body to nourish the young. And both male and female mammals have mammary glands, but it's just the females where the hormone levels are at such a level that they actually produce, these glands are active and produce the milk. The next characteristic that we see in all mammals is a complex brain with convolutions. When we look at the mammal brain, it's pretty unique. Convolutions are folds, and you see all these folds that kind of looks like spaghetti in here. When you look at the brain of a fish or a reptile or an amphibian and even a bird, this part of the brain called the cerebrum is actually smooth. It doesn't have all these folds. And in the evolution of animals and the evolution of mammals, the size of the cerebrum, the top part of the brain that does the higher level processing, was growing, but the size of the brain case didn't grow as fast, and so in order to fit as much brain in the smaller space, the brain had to kind of fold in on itself, and so we see this very typical mammalian brain with these folds. That's like I said, indicative only found in mammals' brains. That when we look overall at the vertebrates, that it's the mammals that have the larger brains and the better sensory and nervous systems. The next characteristic that's uniquely mammalian is complex dentition, or teeth. When we talked about birds, we said the shape of the beak indicates the type of food the bird can eat. But when you look at the teeth of mammals, we also see some pretty interesting things. It's only in mammals that we have this differentiation of teeth, where we have the incisors up here for cutting, and the canines for grabbing and puncturing, and the premolars, and then the molars, which have the flat grinding surfaces. And different types of mammals will have a different distribution of these varied teeth. I mean, if you looked at sharks, all their teeth are basically the same, or maybe a crocodile. They're all just sharp, but this different functionality of different types of teeth, this differentiation is uniquely mammalian. But if you look at the teeth of a carnivore, you're going to see a lot more of the incisors and canines and less surface for the grinding teeth that you'd find. But an herbivore, an animal that was eating vegetable matter only, you would need these sharp canines and incisors, but you'd have a more emphasis on the large grinding flat molars and premolars. So if you look at the jaw of a of a mammal and investigate the teeth, you should be able to figure out the basic type of feeder that animal is. We as humans are omnivores, so we have the full range of teeth for eating both meat and vegetable matter. The next characteristic we can look at are the well-developed lungs with a diaphragm. The mammalian lung is well developed. They have good gas exchange. It's not as efficient as the birds with the extra air sacs, but it's pretty efficient. And we have a muscle down here underneath the lungs that's called the diaphragm, and it's the diaphragm that controls the breathing. And this is its shape, where it's kind of bowed like this. This is when it's relaxed. When this muscle contracts and gets smaller, it drops down. As it drops down, it creates negative pressure, which sucks air down into the lungs. We call this negative pressure breathing, and we can contrast that with the positive pressure breathing we saw in the amphibians. But this is a well-developed lung. We have good gas exchange. Like I said, not as efficient as the birds, which had the extra air sacs, but efficient nonetheless. Now, these characteristics are uniquely mammalian. I didn't draw that the way I wanted to. But the next couple of characteristics that we're going to look at are shared by other animals, but they are still characteristics that all mammals share, but these are the ones that are uniquely mammal. Let's briefly talk about maternal care that we see in the mammals. Like I said, other animals will exhibit maternal care, but in the mammals that maternal care takes on a different nature. Obviously, with mammals having mammary glands and nursing their young, this connection between the mother and the offspring is much more intimate and important. The interesting thing, though, is the length of the maternal care. Kind of interesting. It seems to be that the larger the animal, the longer this maternal care lasts. So for maybe a rodent, the mother only takes care of the young for maybe a matter of like weeks. But for the elephants, for example, it may be many, many years. And of course, in humans, it takes on a whole different type of relationship where it can be, many, many, many years. Next, let's look at the circulatory system. Now, with the birds, we already had our four-chambered heart. In fact, if we go back to the crocodilians and the reptiles, we had a four-chambered heart. And the mammals do also. And so I just put our diagram that we had from our earlier videos up here, and we can see the basic circulation in a schematic diagram. But if we want to look at what a mammalian heart looks like in a little more detail, this is a more accurate, more realistic representation of what the human heart or mammalian heart looks like. And so we see that the right atrium would receive deoxygenated blood from the body, from the top and bottom of the body, and pump that into the right ventricle, and then the right ventricle will pump that blood through the pulmonary arteries to the pulmonary loop to the two lungs. And then oxygen-rich blood would return from the lungs into the left atrium from both sides. This wraps around the back. And from the right atrium to the right ventricle, and then the right ventricle pumps the blood out to the systemic loop or out to the body. We'll talk more about the heart in our unit on the circulatory system when we do anatomy. And finally, all mammals are endothermic. They generate and regulate their own body temperature through their metabolism. Their high metabolic rate will generate heat, and then the hair that all mammals have plays a role in keeping them warm. Now, some of the marine mammals don't have as much hair, but they do have a thick layer of fat called blubber, and so hair or in fat help trap the heat, making them good endotherms. So that's the warming up, but we also have to cool down, and mammals have some pretty interesting physiological means to cool down, and I have done another video on temperature regulation in the anatomy and physiology unit, and you can check that out if you want to see more of that. But mammals are endotherms, so they can live in a broad range of habitat. So there are general mammal characteristics. What we have left to do is to look at these three subgroups in the mammals and see what makes each of these subclasses, the monotremes, the marsupials, and the placentals, different from each other. We need to see what's the basis of this division, and it turns out it has to do with the reproductive event, or the birth event. So the basis of division between the subclasses of the mammals is reproduction. All mammals have internal fertilization, but the length of the time that the embryo is held in the female's body is called gestation, and that's very different for the different groups. So, let's look at our first subclass, the monotremes. The monotremes are the egg-laying mammals. We don't think of mammals laying eggs, but they do. And the egg that they lay is kind of reptilian. It's a leathery egg rather than a hard-shelled egg, so more like the reptile egg than the bird egg. But when the young are hatched from these eggs, they still nurse like all mammals do from the mammary glands of the mother. Now, the only kind examples of the monotremes that we know of are the spiny anteater, or the echidna, and the duckbill platypus. This egg is an amniotic egg, so it has the same extra embryonic membranes that we see in the bird egg or the reptile egg: the amnion, the allantois, the chorion, and the yolk sac, nutrients, gas exchange, waste disposal, and protective fluid-filled sac. So they have an egg. Now let's move on to the marsupials. The marsupials are our pouched mammals. When their babies are born, they're born extremely underdeveloped, kind of premature. And the reason for that is they have a small yolk sac for their embryo, but it's not very large, and they don't lay an egg. So when the yolk sac is used up, they're born, and they finish their development in their mother's pouch. So they're just not fully formed. They finish their development inside the pouch, and so we have kangaroos and koala and possum. There are other marsupials, but that's a pretty good list to know. But the key is that when they're born premature because they've used up the nutrient material they have around them in the uterus, and they have to finish their development. They'll climb up into the pouch and attach to the teat and suckle and nurse and finish their development in the pouch. So now we can move on to the placental mammals. Now, in the placentals, the babies are born fully developed. They have all their parts. They're ready to go. Now, they may not be able to care for themselves yet, but they are fully formed. Now, the key to that is the structure of the placenta. So we need to talk about what the placenta is and what it's doing that the other mammals don't have. So if we draw some pictures here, and so I'm going to draw a little embryo. So here's my embryo, and it's inside the uterus, and it's surrounded, of course, by the amnion, the fluid-filled sac that all amniotes have around them. Now, instead of having a yolk sac, the placental animals have a structure called the placenta. It's an extension of the baby's body. You'd think an umbilical cord from where your belly button is, and this tissue comes out here, and it attaches to the wall of the mother's uterus. And this placenta is got lots of folds in it, and it grows right into the wall of the uterine lining of the mother. And this placenta is vascularized, meaning there's blood vessels from the baby that run out in here. And these blood vessels that are in this placenta allow for exchanges between the baby's body and the mother's body. The uterine lining is also highly vascularized, but the one thing to know here is that the mother's blood and the baby's blood never mix. There are just exchanges made back and forth from the mother's blood, nutrients and antibodies and other things that the baby needs, oxygen, and from the baby's blood into the mother's blood, waste products and carbon dioxide. So as these exchanges are being made, nutrients and oxygen antibodies can cross over. Unfortunately, so can poisons such as alcohol and drugs can also pass across this divide between the mother's blood and the baby's blood and feed the embryo, and the waste products can be passed out. So the placenta takes over the job of certain embryonic membranes that we saw in the amniotic egg. We no longer need the chorion for gas exchange. The placenta does that. We no longer need the allantois for waste storage, because the waste can be removed to the mother's blood, and the mother's body can get rid of those wastes. And we no longer need the yolk sac for nutrients, because the mother is feeding the baby across from her blood nutrients to the baby's blood. So there are 3 divisions and the basis of those divisions within mammals. So I thought with the time we have left, we'd just run through some of the diversity within the placentals, because we're placentals. Now I know this is a lot of typed words on a TV screen or a computer screen, and that's a lot to read, but let's just look at this. Within the subclass placentals, we have a lot of different orders, and this is not all of them. These are just the ones you have to memorize. kind of kidding about that. But, you know, these are ones that you should be a little bit familiar with. These aren't things that should be too unusual for you. We have the rodents and the Lagomorpha, which include the rabbits, the Chiroptera, the flying mammals, the bats, order Cetacea, and think sea, Cetacea, the swimming, some of the swimming, the dolphins and the whales, the swimming mammals. And we need to address that. Mammals are terrestrial animals. The evolution of the dolphins and whales represents a movement back to water. These are air-breathing with lungs mammals. And so it's interesting that somewhere in evolution they return to water, but we've been terrestrial ever since the reptiles. The Sirenia with the manatee, and if you've ever seen manatee in the wild, the word serene or calm is a appropriate term for them. So, and then the Carnivora, which are all the cats, lions, and bears. Insectivora, Edentata, the armadillos. We're here in Texas. We have lots of armadillos. The order Perissodactyla and Artiodactyla, are hooved animals. The difference here is odd-toed. By odd, usually the number 1. 1 is an odd number. If you think of a horse footprint, it looks like this, as opposed to a deer footprint, which has kind of has 2 toes or even-toed. The proboscis means nose, the elephants with their long snouts, and then the primates. So let's look at some pictures real quick. Just for the cuteness factor, we have our rodents and our Lagomorphas, our Chiroptera, the bats, the Sirenia, the manatee, and the Cetacea, the dolphin. On this page we have our Carnivora, the cats and the dogs and the bears, the canines and the I don't know the order name for these guys, but they're awful cute. And then we have our insectivores and our armadillos, our edentata, our hooved animals, the odd-toed and the even-toed hooved animals, mammals, the proboscia, the elephants, and finally the primates. And this one went a little long, this video, but I hope that you got a good overview of the subclass mammals, and that is our last video in our series on vertebrate diversity. We worked our way up from the other chordates, the subphyla of chordata, through the vertebrates and all the way up to mammals, and then within mammals we ended with primates.